Right, so we're entering the second phase of our modeling process. Now we're going to be UV mapping our bowling pin. One of the things I like to do before I start actually UV mapping is that I'm going to delete my construction history and my transformations. So this is going to be really important when I'm going to be entering the unfolding stage. If my transformations aren't set, my UVs are going to deform in a way that I don't expect it to. So making sure that my transformations are frozen or set to 0 and 1s in my scale is going to help out the process a lot more. And just as a common practice, you always make sure you delete your construction history. Don't confuse this with the undo history. You can, right? It's not going to affect your undo history. You could undo after this. The construction history is just every single step I've done during the modeling process. Extrusions, deleting, connecting things, that all is stored right here. So it takes up memory. If it's a really dense scene, it makes it run a lot less efficiently. So every now and then I like to click here, delete history, and as you can see, it completely deleted all of that construction history overall. And I'm gonna freeze my transformations to make sure that this is the definitive proportions of my model. Right, so now that that's set, if we head on over to UV editor, you're gonna see that this is essentially what we have right now. Now this isn't very good for the purposes of our textures that we'll be gonna be doing later on. So we have to create a new UV shell for our model. So what we're gonna do is head on over to UV once more, and we're gonna delete the UVs we have. This is gonna be our first step. And then we're gonna apply a new UV shell over our model. So we're gonna go over to UV and then head on down to planar projection. Go to our settings, and I like to set my projection to camera based. Right, we leave all these settings as is, and then we're gonna press project. And now we have essentially a new fresh coat of UVs over our model. But a few issues that we have here is that right now it's all being projected from a singular angle. Right now this is my checkerboard, and you can see what I mean here. If I turn around, you'll notice that the texture is being projected in a mirrored way on both ends. This is a rather inefficient way to have your UVs organized, because right now everything is overlapped, some things on top of the other. I need to cut this so that both the front and the back view of my pin is visible in my UV space. So to do that, we can use our 3D cut and sew tool. That's right over here. And the way this works, right, if you hold right click, you can go to component edge and then double click where you want to make our cuts. So a general rule of thumb when it comes to UV mapping is that you're gonna want to do it in areas that naturally have edges or 90-degree angles, right? This corner right here, this is gonna be a transition from one shell to another. And I'm also gonna add one right around here. This is less orthodox of a cut. This might create some seam texture errors later on, but the idea is I want to have this region be able to open up as much as possible. So I'm adding a cut at this point right here to avoid my shells from stretching or squashing in ways I don't expect them to. And then lastly, I'm gonna add a cut in the back of my pin. Basically adding a cut in an area that isn't typically visible, or I wouldn't notice all that much, right? The thing we're gonna be seeing most is the front of the pin, or that's where a lot of our textures are gonna be. That's where we're, at the front is where we're gonna put our logos, etc. So we can kind of hide this seam at the back. Once that's done, we actually have to unwrap our UVs, because even though they're cut into different UV shells or islands, they're all still overlapping one on top of the other, and they're also stretched. And by stretch, what I mean is you can kind of notice here in this region in my checkerboard, this whole region right here, where it should be squares, now we have these weird arches happening around here. And they're also not uniform. They start warping and then merging into each other. And this is really inefficient because our textures aren't going to look uniform later on. So, right, now that we have those cuts, we can actually start flattening this out. So I'm gonna hold right click. I still have my 3D cut and sew tool turned on. So I'm gonna hold right click, component, UV shell, and now notice how it lets me select specific regions of my pin. These are my shells. So I'm gonna select them, hold right click, and then unfold and layout. This is my second to last step now that we've cut and unfolded our UVs. We could, in theory, just use this and start texturing. However, this isn't a very efficient way to pack our UVs. We're organizing them within this specific region. For now, we're always going to be working. Notice that there's a number and a letter here, right? This is our main coordinate. We're always going to be working in the U1 V1 1001 coordinate. Anything outside of that is going to give us issues later on. So we're always going to try to fit all of our UV shells in this one specific region. So to organize them a bit better, I'm going to press Q to go back to my normal selection tools. I'm going to hold right click, UV shell, and I'm going to select it, right? And the way this works, it's the same controls as if you were working in your 3D workspace. You can rotate them, and I'm just going to literally just string this out and then move this a little bit more to the left, to the right, sorry. And these two I can leave as is. And now you can kind of see what's happening here. Our UV shells are now evenly distributed, our checkerboard, sorry. And this is the seam I was talking about, right? This is where we have that interruption in our main pattern. So for most cases, especially here in the pin, it's not gonna be that big of a deal. But if I wanted to add like a specific pattern, if I wanted to add scratches in a certain way, they might get interrupted here and cause some visual issues where it's essentially gonna pull me away from the story, right? Because it looks fake. It's gonna, like, bowling pins don't have seams in that area. So it's gonna look weird, it's gonna look a bit off-putting. But since we're putting it in the back of the pin, it shouldn't be that noticeable. And in applications such as Substance Painter, things like triplanar projection kind of hide some of these seams. So it's not gonna be that big of a deal later on. But it's still important to kind of have those common practices when it comes to adding your UV shells. Lastly, this is essentially it. Right, we've UV mapped our bowling pin. Now all I gotta do is go back to object mode and re-delete my construction history, because again, every cut, every projection that we made added to that construction history. And it's a good practice to delete that once you're finished. Right, so freeze transform just in case, delete history, and we can also center the pivot just in case. This is also gonna be very important later on for when we want to do our simulations, but that's going to be coming up later on. And that's essentially it for UV mapping.